So everyone has, I got in trouble for this last week, you guys, so if you want me to get to come back, please fill out your survey. Everyone has a survey in front of them, and it's really important. I am one of the members of the Education Committee, and we spend a lot of time looking at the surveys and making sure that we listen to you, and we really do listen to what you guys tell us in terms of how you like our speakers, the subjects that you're interested in, what things you want to see come your way. We have a really great education committee. The committee gets together, we find all the speakers, and some of us do the speaking ourselves, obviously. We go out, we buy lunch, we have people who man the tables, we organize the whole thing, and we meet and we do it because we love and believe in education. So first of all, I just want everybody to just give a quick round of applause to the folks that are manning the table. You got Jason and Sunita up front. Natalie brought us lunch today. Thank you so very much, Natalie Whistler. And Robin is always doing everything for everybody, and she's the one who sends out all the reminders and invitations. And if, as you know, if you want a copy of the recording, you would email Robin, and she makes sure that you get everything you need, and she makes sure our committee gets everything that we need. So please, 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 we're actually going to have a guard at the door at the end of the day to make sure nobody leaves without completing their survey. I know I make a lot of jokes, but we're serious. Just please take the time to do that. Also, if there are questions that you weren't comfortable bringing up during the class or complicated questions, write them on the back, and I'll stay after, and I'll go over and answer any questions that you have. But I want to jump right in because I want to really dig into contingencies. There's a lot of stuff that flows and follows. So I'm going to ask you guys, it's going to be a little bit of a wild ride because we're going to be switching back and forth from forms to the RPA to the grid, but I think we can all handle it. I did add on the top corner of every slide, I put what page we're on and what section we're on that page. So hopefully that helps, because I know last week I didn't do that and it made it a little bit confusing. So thank you for being here. Let's jump in. So last week we covered everything up to contingencies, and we're starting with contingencies right now. So let's get into it. So before we talk about contingencies, or as we talk about contingencies, I like to think about the time periods. And so I've got this arrow up just as an illustration of how everything flows. So the first thing, we'll go over this a little bit later, but the day your offer gets accepted and you receive, well, actually now it's just the day your offer gets accepted, that's day 0. So all of your days are going to follow after your first day the offer gets accepted is day 0. After that is the time where you're doing your investigation. The seller's giving you everything that they have agreed to provide. We'll dig into that. The buyer's doing their investigation. And then there comes a time where the buyer has done their investigation period is over, and that buyer then needs to do one of two things. They need to remove their contingencies or cancel. Those are the options. Yes, you can extend the contingencies. Yes, you can negotiate and make some different decisions, but there comes a period of time where one needs to remove contingencies or cancel. Once all contingencies are removed, then, we kind of sit back, we're done, thanks very much. Actually, we never get to sit back, as you guys know. But now then the lender's working on pulling everything together, if there's a loan, getting everything wrapped up, titles, preparing the documents. Some folks that, some of your buyers that may be from out of state may think they actually close escrow on the day that they go to the title company to sign their docs. In a lot of states, that's the closing day. They get the keys right then and there. So just keep that in mind if you're dealing with a buyer from out of state. Make sure they understand that there's a couple of more days after they go to escrow and sign, they're not actually going to get their keys and be able to move into their house on that day. After they sign, then things go back to the escrow company. They send them to the lender. They have to be recorded at the county recorder's office. And then once that recording happens at the county recorder's office, it's officially closed. Then and only then can you give the keys to your buyer if you've arranged that with the seller. So just keep it in mind, have that timeline in the back of your mind as we go through and start talking about the contingencies. Now, the grid is awesome. There's some different changes to the way it looks now. First of all the contingencies have been changed to 17 days. That's big and that's different. We used to have a certain time period for inspections, another time period for appraisal, another time period for loan. Everything is at 17 days. And it's really important, and the reason they did that is because they made some changes to the fundamental pieces of what those contingencies now mean. So I'll give you an example. Now, for your appraisal contingency, the only thing to take into consideration is the value. Everything else that comes on that appraisal contingency has been moved to the inspection contingency, and we'll dig into that. But that's important to know that right now they all line up at 17 days. Of course you can adjust them, of course you can move them around, you can make them longer or shorter, but right now they all default to 17 days. The other thing that happens in the grid is you can remove both the loan contingency and the appraisal contingency right in the grid. Those things, you can just check a box in the corner and those can be removed. However, you cannot remove the other contingencies in the grid. You need to use the contingency removal form. Do you guys know where you are? I'm on the grid on page 2 of the grid. Everybody good? The grid is page 2 in your purchase agreement. I'm on page 2 of 16. So in your RPA packet, sorry for everybody who's just jumping in today and wasn't here yesterday. So one of the things we talked about is you got a whole packet of documents, right? The first few documents are your disclosures that are packaged up with your RPA to prevent you from leaving them out. And then you actually get to the RPA about page, I think 6 or 7 of your packet. And the RPA page 1 will say California Residential Purchase Agreement. At the bottom, it's page 1 of 16. And we're on page 2 of that document. And we're in the section L, Contingencies. Everybody with me? Not yet? Let me see.
2 of 16.
Can't see without my glasses. We're right. Contingency, and then at the bottom, the rest of the contingencies, you need to check that box and do a contingency removal form. The other thing that's interesting about the grid is when you change the days, so it defaults to 17 days, as I said before, and then the other one says, or days after acceptance. And they threw in another piece that says, or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later. Okay, so let's think about that. So if we're talking about reviewing the seller's documents, and the seller sends over, and you put down, I'm going to review the seller's documents in 2 days, right? You put that on your offer and you send it in, and that looks very attractive. I'm going to review the seller's documents in 2 days. And the seller gives you the documents on day 0. How many days do you actually have? You have 5 days. Because it says 5 days, it says 2 days, what you wrote in, or 5 days, whichever's later. So no matter what number you write in, you've got at least 5 days. Okay? That's really important to know, both if you're a listing agent and if you're representing a buyer. You've got at least 5 days. The only time you don't have 5 days, and I'm going to say this a couple of times, the only time you don't have 5 days is if you signed all the disclosures prior to or with your offer. Pause for it to sink in. So if a lot of times agents are doing their inspections and they're putting their disclosures up front and they present them to you in the MLS, they're like, here's everything, disclosure iOS, or everything's in there. You sign everything and submit it with your offer. then you do not have the additional 5 days. You've waived that when you signed everything and sent it in with your offer. Any other time, if you did not send in the disclosures with your offer, you will always have 5 days after receipt. Yes?
So that's, a lot of agents put them in the listing and
Yes.
expect them to be signed at the time of the offer because it's a stronger offer, isn't
Right.
it? Because they're signing off on that, like,
Right. So even if you submit a contingency removal and you remove all contingencies, but you did not sign those seller documents with your offer, you still have 5 days. That's huge.
so
Yes.
would you advise not signing those? Like,
No, no, because you want your offer to get accepted, right? So you're always going to balance, and this is really important when you're thinking about contingencies and who pays for what. We're always balancing getting our offer accepted and then doing the best job we can for our clients, right? So you're not doing any job for your client if you don't get it in escrow. So you have to be competitive in order to get your offer accepted. But you don't want to give away everything, right? Unfortunately, in this market, give away everything. Just give it away. Just give away everything. Don't try to hold on to anything if you want to play ball in this market. It's really a super duper competitive market, you guys. And I see it day in and day out. And I had an agent in my office yesterday. She's been writing offers for her clients. She wrote no contingencies, 10-day close, 130,000 over the asking price. Wow. She got rejected. And I hear stories every single day. So that's why I'm saying you really need to be competitive in the market. It's crazy, it's hard, it's brutal, right? Not every single time. Some people overprice, but if it's a competitively priced listing and it's staged and it looks good and it's in a great area, this is what you're going to be facing. Okay, 2 quick questions. You first.
Can they give you a notice to perform after 5 days, or does it go by the inspection period technically?
So if they, after 5 days of them giving you the documents, they can actually give you the notice to perform after 3 days, because it's 2 days. You got those 2 days, right? And I'm going to dig into all of that. Don't worry. I'm going to get on that. Yes?
So even if they check all those boxes, if they're not sending the contingencies, they're really just lying to their face as a listing agent. That box doesn't count if you don't have the documentation.
Not lying through their teeth. So first of all, it's a new purchase agreement, and so everybody's kind of just getting used to it.
They still have 5 days even if they sign that box.
Even if they check the box, if you haven't signed the documents prior to.
Basically what this box tells you is they have an intent to do that, they haven't followed through, and so they still have 5 days no matter what you tell your client.
Correct. Tell your client that, though. Make sure you're telling your client that. All right, let's get into this. Okay, so that's the overall thing that I want you guys to know about the page on the grid. Now let's break down each piece. So let's talk about the loan contingency. So your loan contingency, it defaults to 17 days. And let's talk about, wait, are my pages messed up? Okay, so now Section 8, loans. So the agreement, if you're using a loan contingency, the agreement is contingent on the buyer obtaining loans specified. The buyer shall act diligently and in good faith to obtain the designated loans. But it's very clear that if there's no, I'm on section, see how it says at the top of the page, page 5, and then you see Section 8? That's how you'll know where to go to catch up to where I am. So this part is really important. If there's no appraisal contingency or the appraisal contingency has been removed, you can't use the appraisal contingency to get you out of the loan contingency, right? Because some people try that. They'll say, well, can't get the loan if it doesn't appraise. You can get the loan if it doesn't appraise. You just have to make up the difference, right? So it's very clear that those are 2 separate contingencies that can't be used together. The buyer is advised to investigate insurability of the property as early as possible, because that's another argument. Well, I can't get a loan if I can't get insurance. But the insurance is part of the investigation contingency, not the loan contingency. So if you waived your inspection contingency, The buyer's contractual obligation regarding the deposit and balance of the closing costs are not contingencies. So those are never contingencies, which is why it's really important that you verify that they have the money for their down payment and their closing costs before you even accept the offer, right? You want to make sure you're verifying those proof of funds. If there's an appraisal contingency, removal of the loan contingency does not deem removal of the appraisal contingency. So once again, those two things are separate contingencies. No loan contingency. If no loan contingency is checked, obtaining any loan specified is not a contingency of the agreement. The buyer does not obtain the loan specified. As a result, they're unable to purchase the property. The seller may be entitled to the buyer's deposit or other legal means. So that's kind of new to the purchase agreement too. They've never spelled out that if you aren't able to move forward after removing your contingency, that they may be entitled to the buyer's deposit. So that's been entered, and I don't think it was in the last contract. Yes?
If, for example, everything is going on, all the contingencies are removed, and all of a sudden seller decided that they don't want to sell the property, then what's going to happen?
Seller cannot do that. So we're going to get into that on the seller's right to cancel. We're going to dig into it. The seller cannot just arbitrarily decide that they don't want to perform. They could be sued for specific performance. Yes?
What if on L2, the appraisal, that it's just left
Appraisal contingency is based on the appraised value. We're going to jump into that in just a second, but let's talk about first what it means and what the contract says about the appraisal contingency. So once again, page 5, section 8B, I'm reading from that section of the contract. So it says this agreement is contingent on the written appraisal of a licensed certified appraisal at no less than the amount specified in paragraph 3L. So that's that number that's right there, right? So they're saying that the property has to appraise for either the purchase price or that number that's in that box. However, the ability to cancel based on measurements provided in the appraisal is within the investigation of the property contingency. So that's new and different. And so what they're saying is sometimes you get an appraisal and the appraisal says, oh, it's only 2,000 square feet, and you thought it was 2,500 square feet, right? That's part of the investigation contingency. You cannot cancel based on that using your appraisal contingency. So if you've already waived your inspection contingency and then you find out through the appraisal contingency that the square footage is not there, you can still cancel, but you're probably not going to get your deposit back, okay? Time frames at 17 days is because you need to see your appraisal to find out what's in the appraisal before you waive your inspections, because that's part of the investigation piece of the inspection. The only part of the appraisal contingency is the value, right? So you still got your appraisal report, and that's still great information that your client wants, needs, and should be reviewing. I've sat in court based on the client and the agent not reading the appraisal and missing information. So you do need to look at your appraisal, check the square footage, read all the stuff that's on there. You and your client need to review that. But that's part of the investigation contingency. Yes?
Reading that paragraph B1, that means we should always have a number in this appraisal.
Not necessarily. It's the purchase price or the number.
Where does it say the purchase price?
I'll get to that. We're coming up on that. Janine?
I just want to make sure you're repeating what you're saying, because we're recording and they can't hear what the audience.
Got you. Okay, I will do that. And a lot of the questions that are coming up, I'm going to get to those. When I pause, I'm more so just giving you guys a chance to think and let it soak in, okay? Let it soak in a little bit, because we're going to dig into it more deeply. So keep in mind, the reason that they set this up this way was because in order to get around the appraisal, many of us were writing language and we were saying, as long as the property appraises for this amount but doesn't exceed this amount and doesn't match, and we were all coming up with like all of this different language to deal with appraisal gaps. So the way the contract is written now is the appraisal contingency is only about value, right? And so when we get to here, it says appraisal contingency is based upon the appraised value at the minimum of the purchase price or whatever number you put in there. So this is how you address an appraisal gap. So an appraisal gap means you're saying, you know what, I know I'm writing more than the property's worth, but I just want to get my client in a house. And so my client has a little bit of money and they'll cover the gap between what it actually appraises for and the purchase price. That's called the gap. Purchase price, and if the appraisal comes in low, what it actually appraises for. If it comes in high, we don't care. It's all good. There's no reason to talk about if it comes in high. Only if it comes in low. So you've got the offer price or the purchase price or the contract price, and then you've got the appraised value. That's the gap, okay? And so now in the contract, in order to address that gap, you're gonna do the math, whatever that gap number is. So my client can bring in $50,000 to cover the appraisal gap in this particular situation, this made-up scenario. And so I'm at $1 million. He can bring in 50. So at 9,550 is the number that I'm going to put in that box. Because 50 is the gap, I do the math and I put that number. So if the property appraises for 900, for 9, whatever, whatever it is for that number or anything above that number, my client is still going to buy the property. I said this last week, it's all about whether or not I get to walk away with my deposit. Buyer can cancel, but they just might have to leave their deposit when they walk away.
So we have to make sure that that gap is allocated from in the proof of funds. We have to make sure that gap is,
Yes.
right?
And it's not going to be, it's not exactly, so it really depends on what they're putting down in their down payment. So if you've got a client that's putting 20% down, and let's say that 20% is $100,000. Right? And they have the appraisal gap of 50. Now, when they do their loan, they're not bringing in another 50. They're not going to have to bring in another 50,000. It just means that now their loan to value will not be 80-20. It's probably going to be 90-10, right? So now, rather than putting 20% down and getting a loan for 80%, they're going to be putting 10% down and getting a loan for 90%. They'll probably have some mortgage insurance in that case, right? So their payment's going to go up, but not that much. Now, if they, that's the most important thing I want you to take away, is that's how you address the appraisal gap. And the only way you could do that is to say it's based on a value, is if that's the only determination from the appraisal contingency. So now appraisal contingency is all about value, and all the rest of the stuff that you learn from the appraisal goes on the inspection contingency. So keep in mind, if you remove your inspection contingency, you are going in blind and saying it doesn't matter what the appraisal comes back with in terms of square footage or repairs or whatever other issues that come up. You guys look so, if you could see you from where I am. Yes? Oh, did I put 9 million? Yes, that's a mistype. I'm horrible with numbers, horrible. I'm all concepts, yes.
Just leave that space, just leave it blank, instead of putting some value on it.
You do not have to have an appraisal gap at all. You do not have to address the appraisal gap. If that's not what you're trying to do, there doesn't need to be anything on that line, okay? Only if you're trying to have an appraisal gap and cover and assure the seller that, hey, if it doesn't appraise, my buyer's going to be able to like what's flying right now. The market's going to change. It's not always going to be that way. Later in the fall, it won't be this crazy. But the spring, this is how we roll in the spring. And one, and then we're moving on. Yes?
Can you explain that part you said again? I believe you said something that if you waive the inspection, then you're giving up the appraisal contingency?
No. So if you waive your inspection contingency, right? If you go in, a lot of people will say no inspection contingency, and then later find out that there's information from the appraisal, you can't go back. Your inspection contingency is waived. You just have to live with it. You just have to live with it. That's what I'm saying. Like, because you already removed your contingency, and you removed it without having all the facts, and that's what you chose to do. And I'll get into that when I talk about contingency removal, how once you remove contingencies, even if you don't have all the facts, you remove them. Oh, she's gone. Okay, you get the last question, and then I'm moving on.
You're probably going to cover this, but line 3, 8C, informational access to property.
It's coming up.
Okay.
I'm going down the line. All right. All right, investigation of property and informational access. All right, so the investigation of property, that's your inspection contingency. That's the contingency that you get your footage. That's everything. That's where you review the seller's documents. All of those things are under the investigation of the property. And right now that's set to 17 days. Keep in mind that if you want to remove that contingency with the offer, you have to check the box and do a contingency removal. So here's the section of the contract that deals with that. It's on page 8. It's section 8C. Is that really page 8 or is that page 5? Page 5. Oh, I have the right thing on your documents. Okay. Investigation of property. This agreement is as specified contingent upon buyer's acceptance of the condition of in any other matter affecting the property. So they just lumped it all in, right? The condition in any other matter affecting the property. And then I also want to talk about section 12, which is all about the buyer's investigation of the property and matters affecting the property. So we're going to dig into section 12, which is on page 9. Yes. So it says buyers shall, within the time specified, have the right at the buyer's expense, unless otherwise agreed. So buyer's going to do any and all investigations they want to do that they pay for. They can conduct inspections, investigations, tests, surveys, and other studies. All that's lumped into the term buyer investigation. That includes a home inspection. That includes a lead-based paint inspection. That includes wood-destroying pests, and then it covers everything about wood-destroying pests. And all buyer investigations, such as insurance, go under the Buyer Investigation Advisory, or the CAR form BIA. So again, those are all lumped into the buyer investigation. A review of reports, disclosures, and information prepared by the seller and delivered to the buyer on paragraph 3, and then they name those. And then here's the particulars. So we already know buyer can do any investigations they want to pay for, but without the seller's prior written consent, they can't make or cause any destructive or evasive actions to the property, right? Because they can't say, wonder what's under those carpets. Let me just rip them up, right? Wonder what's behind that wall. Let me drill a hole. Like, they can't do that kind of stuff, right? They also can't bring down the permit inspector to say, hey, can you check to see if this house is compliant? And you can go and search the records, but you can't bring in any government official or anything like that and put the seller in a situation where now they're going to be behind the 8 ball with anybody, right? So none of those things can be done when you're doing your investigation. The seller must, I'm on D, make the property available for all of buyer's investigations. The seller is not obligated to move any personal property, but the seller must have the water, gas, electricity possession. So the seller's got to keep that thing running the entire time until the buyer takes over. Buyer's investigation, so they get to, the buyer shall, by the time specified in paragraph 3L, complete buyer investigations, satisfy themselves as to the current condition of the property, and then either remove contingencies or cancel the agreement. So the contingency period is for the buyer to investigate, find out what the current condition is of the property, and then remove the contingency, move forward, or cancel. Now, during that time, they also get to say, hey, I discovered this, and I need you to do that, and do some negotiating. But at the end of the day, they remove the contingencies or they walk away. And if they haven't removed their contingencies, they keep their deposit. It also goes into saying that the buyer has to give the seller at no cost all the reports. All the reports have to be turned over to the seller, and you can't charge the seller for the reports. They just get them. You have to give them all to them. You do, you do, you do. Not including the appraisal unless it's, so it says that. Let's keep going. Copies of such reports obtained by a buyer, and then it says the obligation shall survive the termination of the agreement, meaning even if you cancel, you still have to give them the reports. This delivery investigation reports shall not include any appraisal except 90 days. It's 90 days. I feel like it used to be 6 months and now it's 90 days. Okay. So you don't have to turn over your appraisal. The only time you would have to turn over your appraisal is if you're saying it didn't appraise and therefore I want a price reduction. Then they would want to actually see that it didn't appraise, and then you would turn it over. But any other time, you do not have to turn over the appraisal. That's the one report that does not have to be turned over.
Wait, you're saying if it doesn't appraise even on a conventional loan, you have to give them the appraisal?
Well, if you want them to reduce the price, then I would want to know. I wouldn't take your word for it. Yeah. Right. All right, almost done here. Also, the buyer has to indemnify and protect the seller for anybody that they bring in to do the inspections. And this is important, realtors, because it says that the buyer has to make sure that anybody they bring into the property has the proper insurance, including workman's compensation and all the other insurances that are required to protect the seller. Here's why it's important to us. Who usually picks the inspectors and stuff? We do, right? So if we're telling our buyers, work with this guy, and he's not properly insured, that's kind of our fault, right? So I hope that everybody that you're working with, you've checked and verified that they have proper insurance. Now, of course, if you call them up and say, are you properly insured? They're going to say, yeah, of course I'm insured. And then you say, so I would definitely take, do that. Make sure you're protecting your clients, because it says right here in the contract that they have to have liability, workman's compensation, and other applicable insurance to defend and protect the seller. And that only makes sense, right? From my seat, I see a lot of craziness and foolishness, but I've seen people like fall from the ceiling and, all kinds of crazy stuff, right? And so the buyer brought those people in there to do those investigations. It's not the seller's fault that that person fell from the ceiling or fell off their ladder or whatever happened. So that's important. Make sure that you guys are taking those extra steps. All right, now we're down into, so informational access. I said I was going to talk about it, but I didn't really. So we threw the informational access in the last revision of the contract because at some point, the sellers get tired of the buyer walking in that property and just wanting to come by and wanting to come by and wanting to come by. And so it limits it to 17 days. So pretty much after the buyer's done with their investigations, they shouldn't keep needing to come to the house. right? So that's why they have that in there, so that seller at some point can just say, okay, you've done all your investigations, just leave me in peace. Let me pack up, let me move out, right? So that's that informational access to the property. Buyer's right to access the property for informational purposes is not a contingency and does not create a cancellation rights as applied, even if contingencies are removed. They can continue to come in and request to be able to get into the property or deposit. But you can still inspect the property. So just because there's no contingencies doesn't mean they can't come in, and they still have the right to do their investigations.
And is it still held to that 17 days?
Yeah, unless you change that, informational access to the property is 17 days. All right, review of the seller's documents. Now, this is what I was talking to you guys about a little bit before in terms of that 5-day rule and all of that kind of stuff, and how it says 17 days after acceptance or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later. That's where this really comes into play, because when you're getting those seller documents, and we're talking about the statutory disclosures, right? We're talking about the TDS, the SPQ, the lead-based paint, all of those are considered statutory disclosures. So let's go to page 6, section 8, E and J. So I'm talking, right now I'm on the section of prelim, and it just addresses that the buyer has to review a current preliminary title report. So that matches up to section 8E in the grid. And then section 8F in the grid is the condo plan development disclosures, basically pointing to the section of the contract where it says that they have to review the HOA documents. And then section G talks about reviewing the liened or leased items, right? So that's your solar stuff, right? The seller has to turn over all of the solar information, and the buyer can review it because that's in place, that they have to review those documents. And remember, it's 5 days after they receive those documents, unless they signed a full contingency removal and they already reviewed those other documents prior to. Let's get into the section down at the bottom, removal of contingencies or cancellation. So this is referring back to if you check that box that says CR attached. So down here, it says for any contingency specified in paragraph 3L, and that's the whole contingency section, the buyer shall, within the applicable time period, remove the contingency or cancel this agreement. They keep telling us that, right? For any contingency, for the contingencies for the review of the seller documents, the preliminary report, the condominium plan development disclosure, buyer shall, within the time specified or 5 days after receipt of the seller's documents, sorry, I don't have my glasses, whichever occurs later, remove the applicable contingency in writing or cancel this agreement. If buyer does not remove contingency within the time specified, seller shall, after giving a notice to perform, shall have the right to cancel the agreement. So that's really all this. If the seller wants to get out of the contract, they have to wait for the buyer to miss one of their contractual obligations, serve them with a notice to perform, let that period go by, and then and only then can the seller cancel. And we're going to get into that into more detail.
Give the notice to perform 2 days prior to the
Yes, yes. Sale of the buyer's property is the last contingency on here, and that is where you would use the COP, right? The contingency for sale of the buyer's property. So bless your heart, if your client needs to sell their property before they buy the property and they're writing their offer contingent, but if that's the case, then you would check the box that the property is contingent, this sale is contingent on the sale of their other home. you would fill out the COP, and you would put in all the details on the COP, which is a whole nother class in and of itself, that COP. And if you guys want to hang out after, we could talk all about the COP, but it's really a complicated and long situation. So I'm not going to go into that. But again, I keep saying how crazy this market is. There's so many other alternatives to having it contingent. I know a lot of buyers don't want to give up their home before they find another home, but that's really difficult to find a seller that's willing to wait for you to find somebody to sell your home and tag that on when they have so many buyers that are non-contingent. Definitely look into like bridge loans. Have your client look into HELOC options. Have your client look into selling their home and making that contingent on them finding a replacement home. All of those things are better options in this market than trying to purchase a property and making it contingent on the sale of the buyer's property. All right. Back on the time periods again, but now I'm in section 14. Section 14 is on page 10. I know I'm jumping around a lot, but all of this stays into the contingency, so I want to make sure that we're covering it all. So I'm on page 10. So the first thing in page 10, time periods and removal of contingency and cancellation rights. So there's all the kind of questions you guys have been asking about. We're about to get into it deep. All right, so the first section is saying that nothing can be changed unless it's in writing, right? No extensions, alterations, modifications, or any changes unless they're mutual written agreement. So real estate should always be in writing, right? Don't ever, even if you talk to someone on the phone, I always think it's a great idea, call the other agent, hash it out on the phone, but then put it in writing, right? You don't need to switch paper back and forth all day, but follow up in writing. It needs to be on an addendum or something. There's so many addendums. Believe me, there's one out there that you can use. Yes?
So if your pest inspection is more than 5 days away from your home inspection, and you've already identified something on the pest inspection that's an issue, do you do your repair addendum after the?
No, you don't do your request for repairs until you have all the information. And we're going to talk about that, because on the request for repairs, when you put it in, you're saying, I'm not going to come back and ask for anything else. It's written into that.
But, okay, but then if
All your investigations have to be done, and then you ask for whatever you're looking for.
so then you ask for an extension of time on the pest until you get the home inspection, so you can put everything together in one day?
No, you have to get all your inspections done during your investigation period. You have to.
But you have to respond within 5 days from getting the report, right?
No, you have to. So if we go back to the time, seller's documents.
Oh, okay.
They're the prelim, the TDS, SPQ, all of those things, right?
Even if the seller orders the pest removal?
Yeah, let's just go back really quickly to, so investigation of property condition is where you're doing your inspections. And that is L3. And that's set to 17 days.
It's just that sometimes the seller actually does the pest and home inspection, so then isn't that a seller disclosure? No?
If the seller is doing it, it would be a seller disclosure, yeah.
Then you're subject to those 5 days again.
After receipt, so it's after you receive it. And that would be after you receive everything.
But you're still entitled to do your own.
You are. Right.
It's always been there, they're just putting it in the contract. They've always had that 5 days after receipt of it, they've always had the 5 days. It's just,
Right.
they're just now putting it in the contract.
Right.
You've always had the 5 days to, because the TC, that's what the TC makes sure, they don't, not all the agents are aware of that, but you've always had that 5 days. It's like the
You've always had the 5 days for the TDS in the SPQ. You've always had the 5 days for your statutory required documents. But when it comes to the prelim and all of those kinds of things, and the condo and leased or liened items, that 5 days after receipt is new in this new purchase agreement. California market, they want you to go in and they want you to remove all contingencies up front. And the way that they're doing that is providing you with the information up front. So you do your investigation prior to writing the offer. And then there's less room to negotiate and less room for fallout. But we're going to dig into time periods right now. So I'm in time periods, so let's talk about it. So, okay. So any removal of contingencies must be in good faith, right? So that's the foundation of everything we do, that it must be in good faith. So in other words, don't try to play tricks, right? You're supposed to do it in good faith, stand up, do it the right way. Delivery of seller's documents. So these are the specific things that we're talking about when it comes to seller's documents. They're all listed right there. Seller shall, within the time specified, deliver to buyer all reports, disclosures, and information for which the seller is responsible for. And so number 9 are going to be items included and excluded, right? So now they're talking about the leased or liened items that the seller needs to provide to you. So if there's solar, they need to provide the solar contracts. 10 are going to be your inspections and reports. So section 10 is going to be if the seller said they were going to do a pest inspection, or if the seller said they were going to provide you a septic inspection. All of those things would be hit under number 10. Number 11 is your statutory disclosures. That's going to be your SPQ, your TDS, your lead-based paint, your fire, your home fire hardening. All of those are the statutory disclosures. And 13, which is referenced here, is going to be your title documents and your prelim. So the buyer is going to review the documents. So request for repair, contingency removal, and cancellation. So let's get into that. Buyer has within the time specified to perform the buyer's investigation. So again, get your stuff done within the time specified. Review all the disclosures, reports, leased documents, and assume that the buyer, Buyer has within the time specified to perform buyer investigations, review all disclosures, reports, lease documents, and to be assumed by buyer and other applicable information which buyer receives from the seller, and approves all matters affecting the property. Then they need to deliver to the seller copies of the statutory disclosures delivered to the seller. So basically sign and return everything that the seller provided. And at that point, the buyer can request that the seller make repairs or take any other action, and they would use the CAR form RR, or the request for repairs. Keep in mind, the seller has no obligation to agree or even respond to the buyer's request, but if they do respond, they'll use either the RR or the RR on the contingencies in this agreement. So it lays it all out, right? So buyer does their investigations. They either say, yep, I'll take it, or they say, put on a request for repairs, whatever things they want to have done. Seller doesn't even have to look at the request for repairs if they don't want to. Whatever decision the seller makes, the buyer then makes the decision to cancel or move forward. If they cancel and they have the contingency in place, they walk away with their deposit. If they don't have the contingency in place, they lose their deposit. All right, let's look at the request for repairs. So request for repairs has several different sections. It's in the packet. It's in the packet. It's in today's packet. It might not have been in last week's packet. All right, request for repairs. First thing you're going to do is put the date prepared and all the other stuff. Hopefully you're using zip forms and it's going to populate all that stuff in there for you. So you got some options on your request for repair. The first section, number 1, that's where you're going to put, like, I want you to fix this, do that. These are where you're just going to list out all the things that you want to have the seller do. Section B is specifically for wood pest stuff, right? So if you want them to clear section 1 or if you want them to clear section 2. Section C is if you want to ask for a credit. That's where the credit will go if you want to ask for the credit. Any credit included in the paragraph is separate and shall not reduce or supersede any other credit in the agreement unless otherwise agreed. And there's credit limits. You can't hide any credits. But what we do want to hide is the fact that there needs to be repairs, right? So typically, and you'll ask any lender, they don't want to know that there needs to be repairs, right? You guys don't want to know that, right? Okay. So when we ask for a credit, we're usually going to put that credit on an addendum, and we're going to put that addendum, because it used to be in the request for repairs, you could check a box and said, see attached addendum. They took that out. That's no longer in the request for repairs, the box that says, see attached addendum, because they felt like we weren't getting that information to the lenders, right? And so that addendum does have to go forward to the lender. It's got to be on the final statement, you guys. The credit needs to be on there. So you'll just put on your addendum total credit to the buyer to be, right? So that's going to be inclusive of any other credit you may have negotiated for any other thing. But good luck with your credits in this market. All right, so buyers request that the sellers modify the purchase price. That's the other option. You can request that they reduce the purchase price. And that usually only happens in a cash offer situation. If you're like, you know what, just reduce the purchase. I am on D of the request for repairs. Number 2 on the request for repairs, if you're asking for something, it needs to be because you just recently discovered it, and you discovered it because you had an inspection report that you need to ask for. Because anything that you knew about at the time you wrote the offer, you should have written the offer with those things in mind. This is newly discovered things that you're asking for on your request for repairs. And then there's a new section, and we talked about this last week, for FHA and VA. If there's anything that you need to request as specific to the FHA VA loan process, you would put that under number 3. Second part of the request for repairs. If the seller agrees to all of buyer's requests or some of buyer's requests and the buyer accepts, the buyer agrees too, right? So if the seller says, yes, I'll do this, or even if they come back later and say, I'll do some of it, the buyer's going to remove the investigation of the property contingency. So they're going to remove the contingency, which is why I was saying, when you make your request for repairs, when you get your answer, you're done. It's a wrap. You can't come back and ask for more, right? Because think about it. If you say to your seller, hey, can you fix this? And they go, sure, no problem, I'll fix it. Some buyers are going to say, oh, how about this? You know, and then the process will keep going on and on and on. So you make all of your requests at one time, they make their decision, and it's done. There's no more requests after that, right? Now, there is a process, as I mentioned, where the seller doesn't agree to everything that you're asking. They can agree to all except. They can say, you know what, I'll do all that stuff you say, but I'm not going to do this. Then the buyer says, okay, fine, and they sign it. But if there's more to it than that, then you go to the RRRR, which is the response to the request for repairs, which is basically the same form, but it's just laid out, I'll do this, but I won't do this, okay? Super easy. I can't go into every single form in detail. We'll never leave. And you guys didn't bring your pajamas.
So you don't necessarily need another CR form.
You do need a CR form. The CR is the contingency removal. So step 1 is a request for repairs, which says, this is what I'm requesting. The seller says, yes, I'll do it. And then you remove the contingency, saying, we're done. You use the form first. Everybody agrees, and then the contingency comes with or after.
Even before the work's done, right?
Even before the work's done. That's important. That's a really important question because you don't wait to remove the contingency until the work's done. The work can take all the way up to the final verification to get done, because the final verification is where you're going to verify that the work has been done. Yes?
The addendum that you were talking about that goes to the lender, is that the addendum to existing?
It would be an addendum to the RPA, and it would just say that
Existing terms, addendum to existing terms, I think that's the document.
you're thinking of the amendment. Yeah, just use an addendum. I don't like that amendment form. Just use an addendum. Yes? It doesn't apply. So let's, not to be rude, but we're talking about something else. Okay, bottom part of section 14, buyer shall, at the end of the time specified, again, remove the applicable contingencies on the CR form, which is the contingency removal form. However, if any report, disclosure, or applicable I gotta do this, disclosure or applicable contingency. However, if any report, disclosure, information for which the seller is responsible, other than those in paragraph 11A and 11B, is not delivered within the time specified, then the buyer has 5 days after delivery of any such items, whichever is later, to deliver to the seller a removal of the applicable contingency. So that's the section that tells you they get the 5 days if they don't have the documents that they're supposed to have. So it says 11A and 11B. So it's specific to certain documents, not all of them, just the ones in 11A and 11B. And 11A and 11B are the statutory required disclosures. Those are the SPQ, TDS, lead-based pay. Those are the only ones that have that automatic 5-day out, even if you've removed the contingencies.
And those are usually the ones that are in the listing, like in the MLS listing, the ones I've seen, that they want you to sign. Those are
There, but that, you know, if they haven't given you those statutorily required documents, they still have 5 days, even if they've removed the contingencies. The only way to get rid of that 5 days is if they did it prior to writing the offer and you signed off on it with the offer going in.
And the seller doesn't get you that stuff for like 2.5 weeks, you have 5 days after, whenever they get
That's right.
That's right.
They give it to you at the very last week, and you're supposed to, like, you're supposed to close on Friday. It extends the close. They have 5 days, like, right? Because if they gave it, if you're a listing agent and you didn't give them your address,
5 days, guys. They have 5 days, right? That's, whenever they give it to you, it's 5 days. So just know that. All right. Then buyer has 5 days. Let's get into this. After delivery of any such items, the time specified, blah, 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 contractual pertaining to the report already seen. Even if they've waived delivery or removed delivery, the report does not revive the contingency, but there may be a right to terminate for subsequent amended disclosures. So if they gave you a TDS and then they amended the TDS or the SPQ, they realized something else happened, and it's not because something was on an inspection report. It's just, oh, they forgot to mention this. Or, oh, while we were in escrow, the downstairs kitchen flooded. Then you get an additional 5 days. If it's an amendment to those documents that they sent you, and it's because they either left something out or something, well, the buyer has that information now. So the seller doesn't have to go back and amend their disclosures because the buyer now has that information from those reports, okay? Once buyer's written removal of all contingencies is delivered to seller, seller may not cancel the agreement pursuant to 14C. So after, if you ever are in a situation where the seller itchy and they seem like they might want to pull out and you don't want to have them pull out, once you remove all contingencies, the seller's basically locked into the contract. They don't have an out. Let's look at the contingency removal form. So your contingency removal form is going to have different sections on it. The one that we want to see happen is the one where number 4, buyer hereby removes any and all contingencies. That's the one that says, we're done, it's a wrap, the seller can't cancel. But sometimes we're not removing all contingencies at once. Sometimes we're removing them one by one. So maybe with the offer, I'm removing my inspection contingency. And then maybe there's an opportunity number 3 where you can remove all. And oh, by the way, removing your loan contingency does not mean that you have loan docs in title. That's not when you remove your loan contingency. Your loan contingency is when the buyer can say, I feel confident that I'm going to be able to move forward with my loan. They don't get to wait all the way until they sign the loan documents to remove their contingency. And a lot of people say, well, I'm not ready to move it. They're supposed to remove it at the end of that time frame, regardless of whether they have loan docs in hand or not, okay? It's their best guess. They're supposed to look at their conditional loan approval and look at everything and say, you know what, I know I can do all that stuff. I'm comfortable. I can remove my loan contingency. All right, so contingency removal, you either remove everything a la carte, you remove all except, or you remove all of it, okay? And then they're going to sign off on it. The seller, the section below it is not the seller saying, I acknowledge your contingency removal. That's what it used to be on the old one. The section below it is for the seller to remove any contingencies that they had in place. So that's different on this new contingency removal. Want to just bring that to your attention. Yes? You said entire investigation. I'm trying to figure out, let's see, review. Yeah, I don't think I have that. Let me switch to my other documents because I don't think I have that one up there. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if you, if you did number 3, if you did number 2, buyer removes only the following individuals checked, or number 3, all except? 2C4, okay, now I'm with you. 2C4, entire buyer's investigation contingencies except. No, so you can, okay, so this is good. I don't have my glasses, but we can do, okay. So C is the investigation. This is good, I'm glad you brought this up, Nikki. So C is the investigation contingency, right? And so the investigation contingency is, so you can either remove it in part, or you can remove the whole inspection contingency altogether, or you can remove the whole inspection contingency but leave one little part out. So that would be only if, like, let's say you didn't have the solar lease information. You would be removing everything except for the solar lease. So it's all of that contingency except one small part that you specify. Do you follow me? But it does include all of the inspection stuff, and you would leave one small part out.
Okay, so it's not just related to just the very top one where it says investigation. So it's all of the
Yes. So we're talking about 2C4, which is specific to inspection contingency. So everything that has to do with the inspection contingency, except this one little thing. Like maybe I didn't get my HOA docs yet. So I'm removing my whole inspection contingency except for my HOA docs. Okay? You guys with me on that? All right. How are we looking for time? We're looking good. We're doing great. All right, that's contingency removal. All right, section 14. I'm back on section 14, which is on page 11. And I'm at the seller's right to cancel. So again, we were talking about the fact that if the buyer removes all of their contingencies, this, is it page 10? Okay. If by the time specified in this agreement, the buyer does not deliver to the seller removal of contingencies or cancellation of the agreement, then the seller, after first delivering a notice to perform, may cancel the agreement. In such event, the seller authorizes return of the buyer's deposit. So if the seller cancels, they got to give the buyer back their deposit. Okay? If the seller cancels, they've got to give the buyer back their deposit, unless it's from a demand to close, which we'll get into. Seller cancel. Buyer's contract obligation. Seller, after first delivering a buyer's notice to perform, they can either deliver a notice to perform for any of the contractual obligations. So buyer has to deliver their deposit within 3 days. You know, anything that the buyer's contractually obligated to do. In some situations, they need to verify proof of funds. You know, maybe you said 3 days after you're going to get the verification of proof of funds. Any of those things that the buyer's contractually obligated to do, if they don't do them, then the seller would issue a notice to perform. Notice to perform is 2 days, and then they could cancel.
And so that is the only way a seller can get out of a contract.
Yep. You guys got to let me get through some of this stuff because I'm going to answer all of these questions. I'm going through it step by step, and I'm going to answer everybody's questions, but I do want to get us through it. So sorry, but I need to get through it. Okay. All right. So the seller, after delivering a notice to perform, may cancel the agreement in the time specified. Buyer does not, if the buyer doesn't take the following actions, so their deposit and all of those things that I just listed. The seller's right to cancel. I'm on number 3 now. Seller may cancel this agreement by good faith exercise of any of the seller's contingencies included in this agreement or otherwise agreed, so long as the contingency period has not already been removed or waived in writing. So obviously they can't cancel if the buyer's already removed the contingencies. Buyer's right to cancel. So seller's right to cancel is very narrow, right? They have to give that contingency. They have to give that notice to perform. Buyer has to not perform, and then it only can cancel if the seller doesn't do any of their contractual obligations, and they give the seller a notice to perform. They can also cancel if they find something with the property that they don't like. They can cancel at any time. Buyer's free to cancel at any time. But if they want to get their deposit back, then they have to have not removed that contingency, as long as that contingency has not already been removed in writing. All right, moving over to the next section, in section 14, it's all about notice to the buyer to perform. It says that the parties have 2 days after delivery, and I keep saying 2 days like that because it's not 48 hours, you guys, it's 2 days. So the day that it's delivered is day 0, and then they have 2 full days, the next day and the next day, all the way till 11:59. I'm on page 11, section 14, right there. So that orange sticker at the top is the page that I'm on.
It's page 10 in this case. No, she just read over, she's now on page 11, the very top of 11.
I'm on E.
Buyers, sellers, 11 and 16, leather. She just read through all of page 10, she's at the top of page 11.
It's 2 days.
After delivery.
It's 2 days after delivery. Natalie?
Isn't it 2 days? They can't end on the weekend though?
Yeah, and I'm going to get to that later on in the contract when we get into definitions. I'm going to talk about all that stuff. I promise you guys I'm going to get to every single thing. Well, I'm going to get to a lot. All right. Effective removal of contingency. If the buyer removes any contingencies or cancellation rights, unless otherwise agreed, the buyer shall have conclusively deemed to have completed all buyer investigations and reviewed all reports and within the transaction, assumed all liability, responsibility, and expense for the non-delivery of any reports, disclosures, or information outside of the seller's control, and for any reports or corrections pertaining to contingencies or cancellation rights in the inability to obtain financing. So in other words, if you remove contingencies, you bought it, it's yours, you're done, right? Even if you find out something later, you're saying if you remove the loan contingency, you're saying I can buy it regardless. You're assuming all responsibility, all liability. It's all on you, right? Once you take that step, it's a wrap. Removal of seller contingencies. Seller shall remove any contingencies or cancellation rights unless otherwise agreed. Sellers shall have conclusively deemed to have satisfied themselves regarding any such contingencies, elected to proceed with the transaction, and give up their right to cancel the agreement based on any such contingencies. G, demand to close. So demand to close is a little different than the notice to perform. The notice to perform is 2 days, and that's for contingencies and contractual obligations. Your notice to perform is either for contingencies or contractual obligations. But when it comes down to closing, right, let's say all contingencies have been removed and they just aren't closing. Either the buyer or the seller, they're just not doing what it takes to close. Then you would give them a form called the to close escrow, and they have 3 days for the demand to close escrow. On the demand to close escrow, the seller can keep the deposit if the buyer removed all of their contingencies, right? That's a little bit different. All right, let's look at the notice to perform. So what we have up here is the buyer's notice to perform. It's divided into 2 sections. One column is all of your contingencies. And so if the buyer is not performing on one of the contingencies or one or more of the contingencies, you would check that particular box. And if it's a contractual obligation, you would check that particular box on the other side. When you give them this, they have 2 days to respond after receipt. And then the seller can cancel after that. You guys don't necessarily have to look at the forms because I got it up there, right? So don't feel like you have to switch. Okay, all right, all right. And then next thing to look at is the notice to the seller to perform. So the seller would just have their contractual actions and then their 3 possible contingencies. I'm back on section 14, page 11. I really don't want you guys to feel like you have to flip from page to page to page. It's just, if you kind of just stick to the contract. The forms I'm just really just showing you just so you have an idea of what the form looks like and how it relates to the documents. All right, section 14H, effective cancellation on deposit. So this section talks about how those deposits would get released and what needs to happen. So if the buyer or seller gives a written cancellation pursuant to their rights, then they would have to either have mutual instructions. So the cancellation agreement is 2 parts, you guys. On the top, it says whoever's canceling, right? Buyer or seller is canceling and the reason why they're canceling. The second part says release of deposit. So you cancel, that's all great. But now what happens to the deposit? The cancellation can be what we call unilateral. One party can cancel according to their rights in the contract. And we've talked about cancellation rights, right? When they can cancel. But the deposit has to be mutual agreement as to whether or not it goes back to the buyer or seller. And that's big, right? That's why a lot of people are willing to risk their deposit, because they understand that there has to be mutual agreement for it to go to any or the other. So what happens a lot of times is, even though it's contractually clear as to who's supposed to keep the deposit, if they both don't sign, then it sits in escrow. And their only options at that point are to go to small claims court or to go to arbitration. Or sometimes we negotiate. And sometimes we'll say, all right, the deposit's $10,000. You know, I know I'm right, but you're being a jerk. So you keep 2 and I'll take 8, right? As opposed to just having the whole 10 sit in escrow. And then they say, no, 2 and I take 8. And then you end up both taking 5 and going your separate ways. I don't know how it's going to shake out, but that's always an option as opposed to just having the money sit in escrow. But if somebody's really certain that they are going to win and they want to take it to small claims court, they may not only get the deposit, but they could also be issued a fine of up to $1,000 if it's very clear that they should have released the deposit and they didn't. So that's also written into that section of Section H. And that's one of my sections that I like to circle, highlight, clip, and send, so that people understand that, hey, you don't get to just play around with this person's money. You didn't do what you were supposed to do. They're entitled to their deposit back, or you lost your deposit because you did something that you weren't supposed to do. So that's my pictures that I have up there. The deposit has to be released either by mutual agreement, arbitration, or judicial decision. And judicial decision is usually small claims court. Guess what, guys? That is contingencies. We made it through the contingency section of the RPA. Quick questions on contingencies before we go into our next section. It's a lot, and there's a lot of moving pieces, and I know you guys are going back and forth from page to page, but I want you to understand how all the pieces and parts go together. So just really quickly, you've got your contingency time frames. At the end of your contingencies, you need to either cancel or remove the contingency. If you are asking for something, you're going to use a request for repairs. Seller does not even have to respond, but if they do, they can respond on the request for repairs. Once you have an agreement, you're going to remove contingencies on the contingency removal form, and then you're going to move forward and go on to the next part of the contract. Their property off the market, and the buyer has an exclusive look at this property, and there's only a particular amount of time that they want to take their property off of the market and give this buyer an exclusive opportunity to purchase the property. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so with the contingencies, do some take precedence over another? So say if
No.
So if you waive one thing, you don't
No.
automatically.
No, each contingency is independent. She asked me, do some contingencies take precedent over another? Every contingency is independent and stands on its own. Yes?
If there is a dispute on the deposit and it's going to arbitration, can the seller still sell the property? The escrow and-
I think what's about a court act, actually, is a list limits against property.
Yes and no. So if most escrow companies will not let you have 2 escrows open on the same property, but some people will just open escrow with another escrow company, and as long as that person hasn't filed a lis pendens, then yes, they can move forward and sell the property. It's not the best practice.
But at that point, they have to release the deposit to the other buyer. It happened to me, and they have to.
If it's at another escrow,
Yeah, if they open with another escrow, and then the other title company says, well, we have to release the deposit to the buyer. And they do.
there's nothing in the contract that necessarily says that that has to happen. I'm only talking about what says in the contract, so. Let's talk about possession really quickly. We still have time. Can you guys hang on for possession? All right. Why don't my papers say possession? All right, we'll just go from here. So possession, time of possession is the next section of the contract. It says that It's going to record at 6, you're going to get possession at 6 p.m. on the day of closing, unless you do something different, right? Where's my dang old papers? So you have an option to say if the property is occupied by the seller, maybe you're going to let them stay in the property beyond close of escrow. Because that's really attractive to a lot of people, right? The fact that they get to close, get all their cash, and then make a move. That's super attractive. And in this market where a seller may not necessarily know where they're going, a period of time to allow them to do that is super attractive. So a lot of times we will grant the seller a license to remain in possession after close of escrow. It's not a rent back, although we always use the term rent back between ourselves. We talk about it as a rent back, but it's not a rent back because they're not landlords and tenants. They were very careful to say they get a license to remain in possession for a short period of time. And that time is less than 30 days, which is equal to 29 days. Less than 30 days equals 29 days or less, right? So if you're staying in possession more than 30 days, then you are going to create a landlord-tenant situation, and you're going to use the form, the RLAS, or the Residential Lease After Sale, and that's a full-on lease agreement. It's got bed bugs and everything to go with it, right? So these are your two options for if the seller's staying in place. You don't have to look anything up. It's just one is the seller in possession addendum, and the other one is the residential lease after sale. So if you check the box for they're going to stay in 29 days or fewer, it'll automatically throw in your seller in possession, or SIP as we like to call it. And if you say they're going to stay longer than that by checking the other box, it'll automatically throw in the residential lease after sale, or the RLAS. If it's tenant occupied, then you're going to want to deal with the tenant occupied stuff. You're going to want to have your estoppel agreements and all that kind of stuff if they're staying over in there. And you're going to want to do the TIP and all those things for tenants.
For rent back, sometimes the sellers stay and they pay the buyer's PITI. When is day one of that? Is that the close of escrow or the next day?
The action that something happens is always day 0. So day 1 is going to be the next day. The next day, yeah. So if a lot of times we're seeing like free rent backs or free seller in possessions, but sometimes they will pay a cost to stay in the property. And I don't recommend putting down PITI on there, because if the seller is in the property and they see buyer's PITI, which means principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, buyer's payment, what the buyer's going to be paying, they're prorated on a day-to-day basis, the seller in their mind is going to think about their payment and what they're paying. And they're probably paying significantly less than what the buyer's paying. So you want to put a real number in there, because you're just, no surprises. Yeah, you don't want that to be like, what? Your payment is, what? You know? So make sure a number is in there. Even if you in your mind are thinking PITI, it's best that we deal with numbers. Yes?
Are you currently seeing more of this versus contingency to sell a house you know how even?
Yeah, I don't know anybody who's getting through a contingent sale. Like, if you do, call me. Let's have coffee. I want to know how you did it. So yeah, this is definitely what we're seeing. Or the seller has a contingency to find another home. They'll write it contingent on the seller finding a replacement property, which is another like addendum or contingency that would be in place, and then you lay out, they have so many days to find a replacement property, and then you say whether or not you're going to do your inspections before they find the replacement property or after they find the replacement property. All those things are worked out with that. But I don't recommend trying to sell a house contingent today. All right. Closing in possession, this is just the occupancy section. One thing I want to bring to your attention is the contract actually says in section 7 that it is being delivered in an as-is present condition as of the date of acceptance. So I get a lot of people that say, can you send me an as-is addendum? There's no need for an as-is addendum. the contract is an as-is addendum, right? It is as is. All properties are sold as is unless you agree to something else later, like you negotiate repairs, and that would be an add-on. But it starts off as an as-is purchase. Property has to be maintained as of the date on the day you saw it, right? Including the spa and the lawn and the grass and all that stuff. The seller, we talked about that before, has to keep the property up throughout the period. Items, if the items, this is new to the contract. If the seller does not remove all of their items, get all their junk or that SH word out of the property, then now the buyer to get in touch with the seller to ask him to come and get their stuff. And now it's like, no, you know you were supposed to move and take all your stuff. You didn't take it. I'm throwing it away. Anything you left is deemed to be abandoned is the term that they use. It's, if you left it, it's deemed to be abandoned. And the seller can, the buyer can pay for those things to be removed and then charge the seller for that cost. Buyer is strongly advised to conduct investigations of the entire property in order to determine its present condition. Seller and agents may not be aware of all defects affecting the property or other factors that the buyer considers important. Property improvements may not be built according to code, in compliance with current law, or have had all required permits issued or finalized. So that's telling the buyer going in that it's on the buyer to review and research whether or not things are permitted, and that when the seller makes their disclosures, they're going to tell you everything they think is important to affect the value or desirability, but it may not be the same things that the buyer thinks is important, right? So you live in a house for a certain period of time, you don't even see certain things, right? You guys know what your house looks like. I know what mine looks like, right? And you just get accustomed to those things. Then a home inspector comes through and points out all these different things, and it's not like you didn't know about them, but you just kind of don't think about them anymore, right? So just keep in mind and make sure your clients understand that when they're seeing those seller disclosures, it's only what the seller is kind of aware of and what's top of mind to them. All right, property condition. Anything that you see on there, that would be, you would put that down there. All right. The next section is all about the seller remaining in possession, and we talked about that quite a bit. And so I'm just talking about the highlights. So if you are doing a seller in possession, whether that be a SIP or an RLAS, residential lease after sale, make sure the lender knows about it and they're aware of it, because it may have an impact on their loan. A lot of loans require that the buyer take occupancy within a certain period of time. Sometimes that's 30 days or 60 days. So just make sure that your lender knows about it, and you know that's not going to come back and bite the buyer in the butt later on. Because now we're seeing crazy things like rent back till June, and it's March, or you know what I mean, rent back for 6 months. Like, is that going to make the seller's loan then a non-owner occupied loan? What's that going to look like? So just make sure that your lender is aware of all of that, and then realize that when you're doing an extended seller in possession, that seller then becomes a tenant and has tenant's rights, right? Anything more than the 29 days, they're now considered a tenant and they have tenant's rights. At close of escrow, the seller assigns to the buyer any assignable warranties, rights to the items included in the sale. The seller shall deliver to the buyer available copies of warranties. The agents cannot and will not determine the assignability of any warranties, and the seller shall, at close of escrow, unless otherwise agreed in writing, provide keys, passwords, codes, and any means to operate. If the property is in a condominium, the seller shall be responsible for securing and providing any such items for association amenities, facilities, and access The buyer may be required to pay a deposit for the homeowners association to obtain keys to assess the HOA facilities. And I just want to point that out to you, that that's in the contract, because we face those kinds of things sometimes. It's like people, if you haven't read the contract, they might say, we don't have to do that. And then you get to circle it and highlight it and clip it and send it, right? So that's what I have for you guys today. We have next Friday, we are going to complete the rest of the RPA. It's not that much left, trust me. You'll see that we've covered mostly everything already. So when we jump into the end of the RPA, once we finish the grid, snap, 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 we're done. We've covered a lot already. Please take the time. There's 2 more classes. The final class, we're actually having an attorney come in, and they're going to be with me, and they're going to talk about some of the kind of I got you points of the contract. So it's going to be more of like a summary class to go over some of the more important details. So if I can do my job right next week, I will finish up, and then we'll have that kind of summary class. Janine's showing me a survey in the back. So please do not leave. We have an armed guard at the door until you complete your survey. And then any questions, right on the